It's really good to be here in Guildford. I've never been here before. So, my bucket list is complete. Yeah, and, I'll present some ideas, especially in terms of how to support the Palestinian struggle, especially in these days when it's crucial, but there isn't yet a political program that we can all get behind, that the Palestinians are working on. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the genocide in Gaza, which should be in our minds always, and spreading into the West Bank as well, the genocide at all kinds of levels, ethnic cleansing certainly, and now spreading into Lebanon, and who knows after that to where. So we have to keep all the victims of these military attacks, state terrorism, because the states have captured the word terrorism, which they use for all non-state actors fighting for their freedom, like the Palestinians. But state terrorism is a term we almost never use, because we have a perfect example of state terrorism today. But today we're going to talk more about politics. And politics, is more cold, it's more calculating. We're thinking about the future. So in a way, to combine genocide, an ongoing genocide, with a vision of the future of people's living together sounds, very dissonant in many ways. And that's why I want to say that even though we're going to move on and talk about political analysis and solutions and so on, this isn't to say that we're ignoring or minimizing what's happening on the ground. What I like to do is especially deal with this issue of reframing. Because if you're going to talk about a political solution, and I want to suggest tonight, and I'll talk about it, that one democratic state that replaces the one Israeli apartheid state that exists today over historic Palestine, from the river to the sea, transforming that one apartheid state that Israel created into a democratic state for everyone, including, of course, the return of the refugees. That's the way we have to go. But more than that, it isn't just a solution. There's 100 solutions out there. I don't even like the word solution, maybe a resolution, maybe a settlement. In order that we're able to advocate for it and to make it a reality, there has to be a flow from the analysis, what the problem is, into what the solution is. You see, and if we start out from the wrong place, so you get a misdiagnosis, that can be pretty serious. And that's what's been happening all these years with Palestine. We've always been misdiagnosing it as a conflict. We all talk about a conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even the Palestinians talk about a conflict. And that's a misdiagnosis because it isn't a conflict. And not only does it work against the Palestinians, but it does not lead you to one democratic state. It leads you to two states, or some kind of weird confederation. It does not decolonize the Israeli Zionist settler colonial project. So the reframing is really important. We have to begin to adopt and use in our advocacy anti-colonial language, and not the language of conflict resolution. Because in a conflict, there's two sides, right? At least two sides. Well, the minute you elevate the Israeli Zionist colonial enterprise, a colonial enterprise has no legitimacy. It has no legality. It's immoral. It shouldn't be. It has no rights. But once you call Zionism and Israel a side in a conflict, you're giving it that legitimacy. You're elevating it to a side. Okay, now, great. Now the Zionists can say, look, everybody, including the Palestinians, see us as a side, and now we're in the game. Okay? And what it also does, of course, is it traps the Palestinians in a box of now being a side. They're not a side. They're the indigenous population. It's their country. They were invaded unilaterally. There's not a conflict. They were never in conflict with Jews. There were Jews living in Palestine for centuries, forever. You know, there was no anti-Semitism. You know, the Palestinians weren't the Cossacks that did pogroms against. There was nothing like that. There was no conflict between Palestinians and Jews. So the whole idea of a conflict is a made-up, constructed, inappropriate framework. But making the Palestinians aside puts them into that antagonistic relationship with Israelis. And it creates a false symmetry. Because now it's not the foreign colonists unilaterally invading Palestine in order to take it over, and the indigenous population resisting the invasion, their displacement, their erasure as a people, but it becomes a fight between two equal sides, right? And how do you resolve a conflict? Through conflict resolution. You negotiate, you compromise, right? So now we're forcing the Palestinians to negotiate and compromise on rights that they have that they shouldn't even have to talk about. There should be no negotiation. Why should the Palestinians be forced to negotiate the status of their own homeland and the rights, so-called, of foreign invaders to any part of it? Right? Should the Palestinians be forced to haggle about how many refugees can come back? You know, there's 6 million refugees, 6 to 7 million refugees. This conflict model, this conflict paradigm forces them to negotiate things they shouldn't negotiate, and from a position not of strength. Because in a conflict, it's not only two equal sides in principle, but one side usually has more power and leverage than the other side. And if you're putting it in terms of sides, Israel is intimately stronger than the Palestinians. It's a state. It's a state. It's a member state of the UN. It has access to all the military equipment. The United States, you know, gives Israel $4 to $5 billion a year in arms. When Hamas brings in arms through the tunnels into Gaza, they're smuggling arms. So you see the difference already between why is Israel entitled to import and export billions of dollars of deadly armaments? That's fine, that's legal, that's normal, that's in fact your country participates in that. And yet the non-state actor that's fighting for its existence has no right to arms. Any arms they have are smuggled in as if they're criminals. So from the conception, the sides can't be equal. A state has rights and privileges and resources that a non-state actor can't possibly compete with, you see? And so the conflict model, as long as we use that term, we're absolutely undermining, subverting the Palestinians' ability to win back their rights. So instead we have to reframe, do a paradigm shift, and the name of what we're talking about is an anti-colonial struggle against Zionist settler colonialism. I would use the word at least struggle rather than conflict, because struggle implies one people struggling against an outside force, an invading force, another force. There's no equality in struggle. And I think that's a much better word. But settler colonialism is a key, meaningful, significant concept that we really have to understand in order to really make it the basis of our analysis that then leads us to the one-state solution. So I want to take a couple minutes and go over what do we mean by settler colonialism. And as we're doing that, we'll also begin to find alternative terms, alternative language that we can begin to use. So there's 3 stages in Zionist settler colonialism, although settler colonialism anywhere in the world tends to follow a similar pattern. Stage 1, I would say, is 1882, because the first Zionist or proto-Zionist invasion took place before the establishment officially of the Zionist movement in 1897. So that there's a history that goes back to before Zionism in the 1880s until 1947, until the partition plan adopted by the UN. But you see, settlers always invent a narrative that entitles them to the land, entitles them to take the land of the native population. The Americans have manifest destiny, right? That God gave them the destiny to take over the continent. You know, the South Africans had the Dutch Reformed Church, that God gave South Africa to the white man. The French that aren't into religion have their civilizing mission. That's the basis of their settler colonialism. The Zionists have a ready-made narrative, which is the Bible, and especially the book of Joshua. If you want to see the textbook definition of genocide, man, read the book of Joshua. I mean, it is genocidal to the nth, and this is God's command. So that genocide isn't only built into settler colonialism, it is. Because you can't come into somebody else's country, take it over, displace them, replace them with your own population, take their land, and erase their presence without genocide. Cultural genocide and physical genocide. You know, the Israelites invading Canaan through Jericho with Joshua, that was settler colonialism. They're coming to another country and taking it over, and God commanded them to kill every single man, woman, child, donkey, cow, goat, anything that lived, basically. So, you know, now we're in it's actually the second round of settler colonialism, and the book of Joshua is the guide for the Zionists. It was Ben Gurion's favorite book. So this becomes really the basis of the narrative the Zionists brought in. The point is that settlers invent a narrative because otherwise they'd be criminals. If we just invaded a country and took it over and killed all the native people, I mean, that's really not a great thing to do. But if you're entitled to do that, if there's a reason why, well, they shouldn't be here, they have no rights, it's not really their land, it's really our land, or we will bring blessings upon them by whatever the narrative is, that's what justifies then the settler colonial project. And that's why until today, it's very hard for us. I mean, it's almost impossible if you go to governments to cast Zionism as illegitimate. But it is. And I mean, we understand. I mean, it's hard, I know, for you guys to accept that, you know, the colonization of India was not a good thing. You know, that colonization in general is not good. I mean, we're getting to the point where we can say those were crimes against humanity. It's good that colonialism ended. You can't justify it, except in the case of Israel. You know, where somehow the fact that the narrative is invented to justify the taking of another people's country is legitimate. So it shows you the power of narrative. It's not just a narrative that the settlers adopt to justify what they're doing, but they use it then as kind of hasbara, you know, as PR in order to convince everybody else, including the media, churches, the government, that in fact this is legitimate. And what's telling about this, and again, it's that inequality. The Palestinians don't have a narrative. That's what makes it so hard for them to compete in the media or compete in the street, because the indigenous people don't need a narrative. The Palestinians never thought of it. Why would they have to invent artificially a story about why the land belongs to them? It does belong to them. They're the indigenous people. They don't have to explain it. They don't have to justify themselves. They are entitled to their country, just like every other people is entitled to self-determination where they are. And so, you see, the whole structure of settler colonialism, beginning with the narrative, already puts the indigenous Palestinian population at a disadvantage. And then the settlers invade the country. I mean, there's a physical invasion. It's not always Normandy. It can be much more gradual. It took the Palestinians maybe 10 or 15 years to figure out that their country was being invaded by the Zionists, because it was in small numbers and rural areas in the beginning. But there's an invasion of the country with the intent of transforming it into the settler country, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish one. And here's another term that arises out of this colonial analysis: Judaization. It's not a term we use. We never use the term Judaization. Some people don't even know the term Judaization. So we talk about conquest, we talk about occupation, we talk about those sorts of things, but actually the unilateral process that describes exactly the purpose of Zionist settler colonialism is Judaization. And it's a term the Israeli government uses. It's not a made-up term. It's in policy documents. We are Judaizing the Galilee. We are Judaizing Jerusalem. We're Judaizing Palestine. That's a term that's used. And that is a much more useful and accurate term for what the Zionists intended and are doing to Palestine than any other term. People are a little uncomfortable because it sounds vaguely anti-Semitic when you start talking. But this is, Zionism was the self-described Jewish return or reclamation of the land of Israel. So it's completely proper to use terms like Judaization. Then there's foundational violence, because every settler colonial project is violent by nature. In other words, you can't come in again and take land and displace people without violence. And even genocidal violence, because your intent is to get them out of the country and to eliminate them. And so we have that especially during the British Mandate time, and especially in the Great Arab Revolt, as it's called, from 1936 to 1939. This was the real foundational violence. The Zionists couldn't do what they wanted to do at that time because they were constrained by the British. It was the British Mandate, and the British were furthering the idea of a Jewish national home and supporting the Zionist movement and so on, but they didn't give them free hand. The Zionists wanted to practice. They had the Haganah. They had their militias. They knew that at some point they had to conquer the country, with the British or without the British, you see, and they needed to practice war, and the Great Revolt was perfect, because the British incorporated Zionist militias into the suppression of the revolt. Thousands of Palestinians were killed at that time, and Zionist forces were very much involved. And finally, and this is something I really want to emphasize, the way settler colonialism ends is through normalization. It stops being a foreign enterprise. It stops being seen as being violent. And the country that they've taken and refashioned in their own image is the normal country that everybody just relates to. There's no more issue. So Israel is Israel. So if you want to go to see the church in Bethlehem, right, that is not in Israel, it's in the West Bank, you go to your travel agent, you buy a ticket to Israel. And you say, I'm going to Israel to visit the church in Bethlehem. That's what most pilgrims would say. And that's where settler colonialism wins. When it's not an issue anymore, it's not a conflict anymore, it simply becomes normal. And at the end of each stage, that's exactly what you'll see. The normalization, or at least at this stage, the legitimization of the Zionist project by international bodies, beginning with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, that was dictated to the British government by Chaim Weizmann, who was the leader of the Zionist community here in Britain, dictated word for word and became British policy. And that's really what gave Zionism its international legitimacy, right? And again, in 2017, it was celebrated in the British government. And then, of course, the Balfour Declaration was then word for word incorporated into the League of Nations mandate that Britain got in 1922. And finally, we finish up this stage with the partition plan of 1947. So without any legal authority, the UN then partitioned Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, as it was called. By the way, in the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations mandate, the Arabs, the Palestinians are not even mentioned. The Jews are mentioned. There's a Jewish national home, there's Jewish rights, there's Jewish community. You never have a mention of the word Arab or Palestinian. They're called, in other words, 90% of the population that's indigenous to the country is called, in the Balfour Declaration, the League of Nations mandate, the existing non-Jewish communities. Talk about erasure. And all legitimized then, again, by the UN. The second stage is from 48 to 67. And here now, you have Zionism unrestrained. Now, Zionism can do what it intended to do all this time without the constraints of the British government and so on. And here you have the explosion at the minute before the British leave. Because in fact, what Israel calls its War of Independence began in 1947, even before the British are fully out of the country. And you have the organized state violence and war and ethnic cleansing on that higher level than the foundational violence we had before with militias. And so the Zionists begin their campaign of what they said they were going to do. In the partition, the Jews got 56% of Palestine. So here in the war in 1948, the Nakba, the Zionists take half the territory that had been allocated to the Palestinian state by the UN. So rather than 42% of Palestine, the Palestinians end up with 22%, which today we know is the occupied territory, but of course, then part of it was taken by Jordan and part was taken by Egypt. But at any rate, the Zionists take then 78% of Palestine in the Nakba, and 85% of the Palestinians who lived within what became Israel, in that beige area, are driven out of the country. 750,000 Palestinians are driven out, which is the basis of the refugee population today, and the Palestinians are denationalized. They're certainly not called Palestinians, because that would undermine Zionism's claim that Jews are the only and exclusive national claimant to the country. And so they're called Israeli Arabs and put under military government until 1966, ruled by actually British emergency regulations that until today are the basis of Israeli rule in the occupied territories. The British emergency regulations of 1945, and then you have the war in 67, and that whole military government that had been over the Palestinian citizens of Israel was simply moved, the personnel, the offices, the equipment, the policies, whole cloth moved into the occupied territory. Israel didn't have to invent the civil administration and its whole governance of the occupied territory. It simply imported it. You have then, besides the ethnic cleansing and the taking of land, then you have the systemic Judaization of the country. More than 530 villages, towns, and urban areas demolished. More than 90% of the Palestinian land is confiscated. But you see, we don't remember that. All we talk about today is the occupation. Even the PLO, in Oslo, we're beginning negotiations. The PLO begins the negotiations here. It doesn't begin them in 1947, when the UN gave 42% of the country to the Palestinians. It's been normalized even in their minds that, yes, this is Israel. So the beginning of Oslo is a beginning where the Palestinians are only claiming a state in 22% of the country. They've already normalized and accepted the fact that they've half the land that was allocated to them by the UN. That's still in force. The UN resolution never expired, is somehow gone. That's the power of normalization. And so the land's confiscated, the populations are replaced, settlements are built, all the names of the rivers, the lakes, the hills, the valleys, the town, everything is Hebraized. So now the whole country begins to be a new country. And then again, the end of stage 2, normalization. The expanded Israeli state onto 78% of Palestine is accepted as a member of the UN. Right? That's a legitimization. And then stage 3 is from 67 until today. And again, we see that same pattern repeated today. Now you have the organized state violence, war, ethnic cleansing, in which Israel conquers the rest of Palestine, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And then it puts in place what I called at that time a matrix of control, which today has grown into a full-fledged apartheid regime over all of Palestine. The matrix of control was to foreclose the establishment of a two-state solution, the establishment of any Palestinian state. And now that the two-state solution is gone, there's been no negotiations. The last negotiations were in 2006. If you remember, when John Kerry was Obama's Secretary of State and came with the last attempt to try to negotiate that failed. And Kerry, not only did Kerry blame Israel for the failure of negotiations, Martin Indyk, who was the chief negotiator, who had been the head of AIPAC, the Israeli lobby in the United States, blamed Israel for the failure. So now, without any negotiations, right, the Judaization becomes normalized. So what becomes a matrix of control, which is an attempt to militarily keep control of a territory and prevent the two states, can give way to an apartheid regime because now that's accepted. Biden is talking now, and your government, of course, is the subcontractor of American foreign policy, so your government does too, about normalization. I mean, Biden never read a book, certainly Starmer never read a book about settler colonialism. I'm not saying they never read a book like Trump, but they never read a book on settler colonialism, right? And yet they adopt the language. What is Biden's initiative? Normalization. Because they get the logic. Whether you're an academic that does an analysis or you're a politician that's trying to resolve this in a pro-Israel way, you come up with the same terminology, normalization. And so the matrix of control gives way to an apartheid regime that's accepted. When Biden talks about normalization between Israel and the Arab world, especially with Saudi Arabia, which is the last remaining jewel in the crown, they're not talking about normalization where Israel goes back to the 1967 borders. Normalization assumes that all the settlements remain, that the matrix of control remains intact. So what that means then is this, and this is where we are today. Years ago, I made a map of apartheid. It was clear that apartheid is the only way out for a settler colonial project. Either you kill all the native population, or you drive them all out. But if, as in this case, you're left with a significant population of the indigenous that you can't get rid of, you're stuck with them. Palestinians are 50% of the population between the river and the sea today. There's 7 million Israelis and 7 million Palestinians. Well, now if we can't drive them out and eliminate them, so that's where apartheid comes in. And now, the apartheid regime, I had always thought was fairly clear. You see the orange areas, you take what's called Area A and B of the West Bank that was carved out by the Oslo process, and Gaza, and that's the 15% of Palestine that becomes the Palestinian Bantustan. And it was even confirmed because that more or less conforms with the route of the wall. So Israel had even built a wall that more or less defined what the Bantustan would be. Now you've got Bezalel Smotrich as the head of the civil administration. He is the governor of the West Bank. Smotrich is a violent settler. Actually, he's been arrested on charges of terrorism in Israel, except you don't prosecute Israeli Jews, so he's never been tried and convicted, but extremely violent settler who is now the governor of the West Bank. As the head of the civil administration, he decides about land expropriation, about home demolitions, about settlement expansion. And what he's done, and people haven't picked up on it, it's not in the news, is he's in the process of taking Area B, that's 22% of the West Bank, right? More than a million Palestinians, taking Area B and taking away the authority of the Palestinian Authority for building and control of the land. A and B had been, the 40% of the West Bank and then Gaza had been off limits to Israelis. That was Palestinian extraterritorial, and they weren't allowed to demolish in areas A or B or build. That's changed. Now he's stripped the Palestinian Authority of that authority and given it to Israel. So now you're beginning to have land expropriation and settlements in B, which means that now the 5 million Palestinians of the West Bank are going to be confined to these dots, these 3 red dots that are basically Area A, the 18% of the West Bank. And we're talking about 18% of 22% of Palestine. And this is the map of the new apartheid, the 3 islands of the West Bank and the southern part of Gaza, because the northern part will be permanently off limits to Palestinians and has at any rate been made uninhabitable. And if anything, that's where Israeli settlers will come in, not Palestinians, if anyone can live there, because it's so polluted that probably not even Israeli settlers could live there. You see, so the Palestinians are again confined to the Rafah area in the south. So this is the planned conquest, settlement, turning into a formalized apartheid system that is then normalized by the international community. Again, that bottom line. The process of normalization and international legitimization. And if you don't believe me, here's the ultimate source. Here's Netanyahu on the podium of the General Assembly, September 22nd, 2023, so 2 weeks before October 7th, laying out in the most public forum possible the normalization process. And he says, this is normalization. And you look at Israel. Israel is between the river and the sea. Now, there is an intent to create a Palestinian Bantustan, because Israel can't incorporate the Palestinian population, then it won't be a Jewish state. But the Bantustan is so small that you can't even see it on a map. So it looks like the whole thing, and the whole thing is Israel, because Israel controls the Bantustan, of course. But this is the idea of normalization with this part of the Sunni Arab world. And this goes together with Biden's idea of normalization that they want to get back to. And Saudi Arabia wants to get back to normalization, actually. It wants to join, completing the Abrahamic Accords that Trump began. Even Saudi Arabia has public opinion. And it can't do it. It's got to a little bit understand and go along with the Arab street, its own population that fervently supports the Palestinians, of course. So it says, well, we will normalize with Israel on condition that in the future, Israel will seriously consider the possibility of establishing a Palestinian state. All right? So with that caveat, we'll normalize with Israel. So the Palestinians are obviously thrown under the bus by Saudi Arabia, and so this is the idea of normalization. And again, genocide is built into settler colonialism. Physical and cultural genocide, but so is permanent resistance. Because the indigenous can never be defeated. They can be eliminated, but they can never give up the resistance, their struggle. And that's why we have to use the word resistance and not terrorism. Because every colonial regime, and yours, was at the top, criminalizes resistance because you never legitimize indigenous resistance because that goes against your narrative, and if you legitimize it, then you're actually kind of a criminal. And so you have to call it terrorism or gangs. The big British word in the mandate were the Arab gangs that were going around doing all this violence and so on. So terrorism is a depoliticized and criminalized term. So we have to reject that, but not only reject it and use the word resistance, but we have to explain to people why it isn't terrorism, right? Now, there are terrorist acts that happen. Part of October 7th, was terrorism against innocent people, like in the music festival or in the communities. But terrorist acts happen, but it doesn't make the resistance fighters terrorists. Even in Algeria, the FLN condemned attacks of FLN forces, their own forces that had brutalized civilian populations. Terrorist acts don't turn the resistance into terrorists. Once you use the word terrorist, that's the all-encompassing term that delegitimizes completely the resistance. And we have to talk about state terror as well, like I said. Just to give you a really interesting figure, there's a guy named Rummel. He has a book called Death by Government. And Rummel calculated that over the course of the 20th century, about 170,000 innocent people were killed by what we would call terrorists, which always means non-state actors. But, he says, over the course of the 20th century, states killed 212 million innocent people. So if you compare non-state terrorism, that everybody's, you have to take your belt off at the airport, versus state terrorism, there's no comparison, to what states do, and that has to be part of our reframing. Now, I happen to be the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. We didn't realize in the beginning that this is the essence of settler colonialism. The demolition of homes, collective means, telling the indigenous population, you do not belong here. You have no place, you can't have a home. This is not your homeland. Get out, in a very violent way. Because the demolitions of homes or hospitals or universities is tremendously traumatic. Besides killing people, it kills the essence of the people. And that's exactly what we see in Gaza and in what's called the D9 bulldozer. The D9 bulldozer is a tremendously powerful machine of Caterpillar. Now, it's a mining machine. Problem is that if a D9 bulldozer hits a building, a house, apartment building, or a structure like that, it'll collapse on the driver. It's not made for that. And so over years, and here's where genocide becomes intentional. People understand what they're doing. Caterpillar engineers, together with Israeli army engineers, sat down and designed a shovel for the bulldozer that when it hits a building, the building falls away from the driver. You see Israeli military columns invading Gaza, they're led by the D9 bulldozers. They're not led by tanks. The bulldozers clear the land. They clear the houses. They clear the buildings. They clear explosives. When Israel destroyed the Shifa hospital, these bulldozers went through the tent encampments of thousands of refugees in Gaza and just rolled them over, bulldozed them out of the way to get to the hospital. This is, from my point of view, the symbol, if you want, a symbol of settler colonialism, of what Zionism is doing. This is the Islamic University in Gaza, before and after the destruction. And the commanding officer, Barak Hiram, destroyed the university with no orders whatsoever. He was reprimanded, in fact, by the Israeli army. There was no military necessity. There were no tunnels. It wasn't a Hamas command center. He said that he destroyed the university because it was a cultural symbol of the Palestinians. And all the universities have been destroyed. So this is cultural genocide. And in fact, if you look up on the internet, you'll see pictures of Israeli soldiers. They burned the library. And there are pictures of Israeli soldiers sitting in chairs in the library, holding up library books in Arabic as the library is burning behind them. So this is the genocide of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism can win. It has an end, like I said. It can win if, in this case, Palestine is Judaized, which it has been to a large degree. And then if it's normalized, and in this case with an apartheid regime. We're on the cusp of this. When Biden says, let's get back to normalization, he means, let's say November, maybe, there'll be a ceasefire. And the fighting dies down in Gaza. Then he's intending to revive the normalization process. So let's say we're talking about January, February, March. So this intended ending of the Zionist settler colonial project that began 130 years ago is ending soon, according to the powers that be. And again, so this is like the end of stage 3, right? Now, we're all committed to defeating settler colonialism, which is not an easy task, especially here, where the settler colonial project has such legitimacy in our governments and in our churches. I mean, I can't even speak in a cathedral because the church won't allow me to speak. So, we have a major task in front of us, but it can be defeated. And it has been defeated if we summon the power. And here's where we're in a dilemma right now. And that is that we know what has to be done, but for all kinds of reasons, we're not there. There has to be resistance. And the resistance has been going on for decades. So that's strong and that continues, but it's not enough. At some point, resistance has to turn over its accomplishments on the ground in terms of halting the settler colonial project, has to turn it over to political people, because there has to be a political resolution. And so there has to be a political program that's accepted by the Palestinians and advocated for, and that we're missing. And I'm not saying this to blame Palestinians, certainly. We're missing it for very good reasons. We're missing it because Israel and the United States in the Oslo peace process dismantled the PLO, created a Palestinian Authority that's a collaborationist authority, and destroyed the political vehicle of the Palestinians to push ahead any political program that the Israelis and Americans didn't approve of. And then the Palestinians have been dispersed throughout the Middle East and here in the diaspora, so that it's hard for them to come together around a political program. They can't even communicate. You can't do a Zoom call between the 350,000 Palestinians in Lebanon and Palestine. It's against the law in Lebanon to have any contact with Israel. And for the Lebanese, that includes Greater Israel, including the Palestinians. So getting together, formulating behind a political program is very difficult. And then with a political program, we're able to mobilize you. You're mobilized, you're out there in the streets, and there's student encampments, but you're missing an end game. You're missing that program to bring forward to governments. And that's the problem. And that's where we think one democratic state is the solution, but we're not quite there yet. So let me finish by just talking for a minute about what do we mean by one democratic state. First of all, of course, if it's settler colonialism, you've got to decolonize. And that means dismantling all the structures of control and domination that Israel and the Zionist movement have set over Palestine. Colonization then creates kind of a level playing field, and then we can create one democratic state. And it's fairly straightforward. It's not a complex sort of a thing. And there's no hidden agenda. There's no trick like you have in the two-state solution. There's all kinds of ideas about one land for all, of separate citizenships, confederations and federations. And because the Zionists know that the two-state solution is gone, so they're scrambling, how do we salvage the Zionist project somehow within a one-state framework? And you have all of those kinds of things going on, some of which Palestinians are buying into. The one democratic state idea is simple, transparent, honest, and straightforward. You have one democratic state, one constitution, one country, one citizenship, one parliament, one legal system, a state that belongs to all its citizens. And then, of course, the refugees have the right to return, which is crucial for the Palestinian struggle. And we also get onto the idea of how do we reintegrate them into the country? How do we deal with the land issues? Bringing them back to their lands and homes and so on. Of course, like in any democratic state, you have individual rights are guaranteed, right of expression, association, movement, and so on. And then, and here's where we get into the controversy among Palestinians that I'm not going to get into in depth, and that is in our One Democratic State campaign conception, we also guarantee the rights, the collective rights of all the groups in the country, whether they're national groups like Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs, or ethnic groups, or religious groups, or any political association. Everyone has a right to their collective identity in this one state. And that's the problem, because Palestinians in principle do not recognize the national identity of Israeli Jews. And they say, with logic, they say, look, they invented Israel. They invented Zionism. They invented the narrative. They constructed the settler colonial enterprise. What, are we going to turn around now and legitimize it? And say, yes, there are Israeli Jews? No, we're not going to do that. And so most Palestinians reject the idea of giving Israeli Jews a national standing. The problem is that after all these years, there is an Israeli Jewish national identity that can't be reduced to something else. And so what we're arguing, but this argument within the Palestinian community is in some ways, what's holding up the formation of a coherent ODS campaign, and that is we're arguing that there has to be a civil state that belongs to everyone, where everyone has equal citizenship, and within that, you create a space for the Palestinian national group, for the Israeli national group, where they have full cultural expression, cultural self-determination, but within the framework of the civil state. Whether it's going to be one Palestinian state or one civil state is really a major issue that we have to deal with. And finally then, with one civil state, whichever kind it is, you have a new civil society emerging of young people for the future. Then we're sort of in the meantime kind of a mode. We have to stay active in advocating for the Palestinian struggle, in pushing it forward, but in a situation where we don't yet have a political program, an end game to advocate for. So it's a difficult kind of transitional period that we're in. And so I would say these are some of the things that you can do in the meantime. A lot of it is keep doing what you're doing, because you're all doing active things and important things, campaigns, BDS, lobbying, protesting in the streets, working in your churches, in the government, all that, keep doing it, even though we don't have that end game yet. Begin to use this anti-colonial reframing so that when we do get to a time when the one democratic state program enters into the political discussion, people understand the logic of it because we've explained to them the logic of settler colonialism and introduced language like resistance that you don't hear very often, instead of terrorism and so on. And then there's a whole series of stop campaigns that we can do. Stop arming Israel, which is already a campaign. Stop apartheid. Stop the normalization process, which is probably the most urgent thing to do. But it's very hard. Normalization is a very abstract, dry, academic term. It's hard to go out in the streets and mobilize people against normalization. But that is really the issue, and that has to be up front, because if normalization takes place, our struggle is 1,000 times more difficult, and that could be soon. I would strengthen cooperation with Palestinians in Palestine. There's a certain disconnect between what's going on here and in Palestine. The Palestinians have not been brought into the discussions here. When there are webinars, there's the same 5 celebrity Palestinians that are invited. There's a lot of voices out there that aren't included, and Palestinians often aren't brought into the discussion. And finally, we want to begin to initiate a campaign to expel Israel from the UN. Why that's not a campaign already, I don't know. There is no mechanism of replacing one state with another in the UN. Israel is a member of the UN, and that gives it tremendous legitimacy. If we want a Palestinian state or a civil state to replace it, there is no mechanism. So we have to separate the processes. We can demand the expulsion of Israel from the UN on its own merits. That has nothing to do with Palestinians. Israel was accepted as a member of the UN on condition that it abide by UN resolutions, which it never does. It's committed genocide, it's violated all the human rights covenants of the UN. There's a case simply on the merits of what Israel has done to expel it. That's done by the General Assembly. The Security Council can veto that, but the General Assembly can override the veto. by, I think, a 2/3 or maybe 3/4 majority. And we must be close to that majority in the UN of countries that are willing to expel Israel. So that's the first part. And then once Israel's out, now you've got that space to then advocate to accept Palestine as a member state of the UN. So I think that's a crucial campaign, because without that, there's no way in which we can replace Israel with something else.